Cool. So thank everybody that's on the call for joining us today. Um, we're pretty excited to talk about all things mead and nutrition. We've got Devin here as well as Billy from Lost Cause Mead. What I'm going to be doing is launching a poll just to kind of get a feel of where everybody lies with experience, with profession. I'll go ahead and share the results after, but this kind of helps us gauge who we're talking to a little bit to help tailor some of the information that we're giving to make sure it's most applicable to everybody that's joining us. A couple housekeeping notes. The recording of this will be available on the White Labs YouTube page probably as early as this afternoon. So if you need to dip out early or want to rewatch it, you're always welcome to join there or email myself, efowler@whitelabs.com, which will give my email out in some of the correspondence. So give everybody another couple minutes here. And we've got somebody calling in from Brazil, so thanks for joining us. That's awesome. And as I said, I'll share the results of this poll, but it looks like we've got about 10% professional mead, high level of experience, about another 10% of novice experienced professional mead makers, about 65% homemakers, as well as another 12% cider, wine, beer. So, and then just some probably beer, wine, and mead geeks on the call as well. So we hope to make this information applicable to everybody on here. Cool. So today we're going to be talking about just a brief look at the nutrient needs of mead. A lot of this information is very applicable to other beverages, which we'll touch on, but for the context of this, we're really going to be talking about mead. My name's Erik Fowler. I'm the education manager at White Labs. Devin and Billy, want to give a quick intro to who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name's Devin Tani. I'm the research and development technician at White Labs. A lot of what I do is learning more information on our yeast strains, as well as helping troubleshoot or go on the newest trends for any fermentation science-based elements.
I'm Billy Beltz, co-founder and worker bee at Lost Cause Meadery in San Diego. We've been around for about 3 years, just opened a new tasting room production facility, and stoked to be part of this. Thanks, Erik.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you guys because I think this is partially conversations that we've all had in our tasting rooms over the last couple years together. So it kind of made sense to share that with the World Wide Web and kind of give people a glimpse into what the three of us talk about day in and day out anyway. So I'm excited. It should be fun. Like I said, if anybody has questions, we'll save them to the end, but go ahead and type them with that Q&A function. But we're going to go through some of the content and hopefully answer a lot of the questions that you guys may have. So what is mead? So a brief overlook of what beverage we're even talking about, right? We're primarily talking about a ferment of honey and water, which dates back almost 10,000 years. So arguably one of the oldest fermented alcoholic beverages in existence, but it's still very relevant, and not a whole lot has changed in that time, which is what makes it really cool. A lot of the science and understanding of the processes have changed. The qualities most likely changed, and the consistency, but the premise of what makes this beverage special hasn't really changed, which is a really cool fundamental truth. A pretty wide ABV range, so 5 to 18%, most of them being in that higher wine, fortified wine range. But there are more and more session meads available, which Billy, you could probably talk on a little bit more when we're talking about some of the nutrient requirements and how that's affected by modern and trending styles. I personally really like the more sessionable meads, especially, San Diego summer being pretty hot in this heat wave we're going through. So being able to have a little bit more volume of something's always kind of nice. But today, craft mead makers are really pushing the boundaries. And Billy, I think you have really shown me that on every time we're talking, you're using some different crazy adjunct or different infusion that I had never seen before in mead. But with that, you've been one of the highest acclaimed and award-winning meaderies around. Did you want to touch a little bit on maybe what makes you guys special in your approach to working with traditional mead or some of these unique flavorings that you're working with?
Yeah. So what I love about mead is how versatile it is. Even when you look at the current craft beer scene and you think, oh, it's so crazy, everyone's doing all this wild stuff. Mead is that, but exponentially greater. And that's what makes it a lot of fun to do. So even just the base sugar, right, can vary in flavor and aroma and taste so widely. And then you get into, well, it could be bone dry to, super sweet, carbonated, not carbonated, ale yeast, wine yeast, distiller's yeast, and then any kind of adjunct and barrel and all that stuff. So that's kind of what we have been trying to do, is push the boundaries in the different areas and see what we like and what our fans like. So like this fall, we're going to be releasing a bunch of decadent dessert meads, one made with blueberries, candy cat mushrooms, pecan, mesquite honey. And so very, desserty, kind of like pastry stout style. And then we're also, this harvest season, we've been collecting wine grape skins from all the wineries locally in Southern California. And normally they just compost them, right? If they're making a whiter rosé, they're not going to age it on the skins. So we're making traditional meads and they're going to age it on the skins to get all the tannins and flavor from that. And we already have, the sugar and the alcohol from the honey. So from the traditional mead. And that's just so that's going to be like a dry, wine, orange wine, rosé type style mead. And so that's just two examples, but that's kind of what we're trying to do is really go all over the place and see what sticks and what we like. And that's what makes mead so much fun.
So we'll get into some of the more details on it, but when you're drawing inspiration for coming up with these flavor profiles, are you looking at other beverages? Like you mentioned, pastry stouts. And when you are working with these new ingredients, do you take into account maybe additional process changes or needing to work with a new yeast strain or change up your nutrient schedule? Or are you really just working from a baseline and kind of tailoring it every batch based on that?
No baseline. It'd be easier. But I mean, so for, the dessert style meads, there's definitely great examples out there, and we kind of do our own twist on it. And that absolutely will dictate how we start. What's the base honey? What's the starting gravity? Where do we want to end this with sweetness? And then that's going to dictate nutrients, which we'll get into and all that. But then, I've been really stoked on like orange wines and kind of weird, funky wines this year. And so then when we start doing those, looking at what kind of honey would best support which kind of grape skins, and do we want to do our normal traditional, really clean and beautiful house yeast, or do we want to do something a little funkier, maybe something with a lot of esters? Or so yeah, kind of the style definitely dictates the yeast, then that'll dictate the nutrients and the gravity. It all kind of has to come together. Half the time we get it right.
Yeah, it's an expensive mistake to make. So I'm not as envious of mead makers as the beer world that I'm more ingrained in. But Devin, so you've done a lot of R&D trials on different yeast strains in different beverages. Obviously, each strain produces some positive characteristics and has potential to produce negative characteristics, which is very variable depending on the beverage you're working with and what your desired profile is. What's your very broad experience when it comes to working with different yeast strains, or your outlook of working with different yeast strains in mead, nutrients aside? Let's just talk about just broad flavor production.
Yeah. So we have noticed really huge ranges of positive attributes of the metabolites, the byproducts that fermentation causes with different yeast strains. Here at White Labs, we do have a huge plethora of our core strains that you could readily choose from. But with mead, because you really want that honey to shine through, you're probably not going to choose something like a Belgian or a Saison strain, which is going to produce all these more phenolic characteristics that might clash with the honey. A lot of times you want a clean producing strain, so maybe like a California ale strain, or even just a regular wine champagne yeast strain. It really depends on the profiles you're trying to work with. If you're trying to go more ester forward, maybe I would recommend some English or Irish strains to try that as well. I believe the biggest component to mead making, if you are going high gravity, is making sure you do have that alcohol tolerance correct for your yeast strain selection.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is flavor is what matters at the end of the day the most, right? If you have a strain that performs well, if you have a base honey that tastes great, but you don't have that strain impact that's promoting the characteristics that you're looking for, everything else that we're about to be talking about is kind of a moot point, because you need that performance, but you also need it to perform producing a quality product. So that's a great point. So, when we're looking at mead, there are a lot of stresses, like you mentioned, high gravity. I think that's one of probably the most important aspects of strain selection that you would want to consider when choosing a strain for yeast, aside from flavor production. So, you're working with an abundance of simple sugar, but there's a lot of sugar present, which, believe it or not, can be very stressful for yeast, which, when we start talking more specifically about nutrient regimes, it becomes very important. But you also have, a fairly low pH. You have a high amount of ethanol, which is very, very stressful for yeast. So you can have a yeast that on paper is able to ferment that fructose and glucose into those positive byproducts, but there's a chance that it's going to stall out and not complete the fermentation, which is not what you desire. You want to have that control and not stress your organisms out and produce inferior products. But most importantly, which is the premise of what we're talking about today, is low nutrient availability, right? Not having the proper nutrition present to allow a complete fermentation or favorable byproducts. So your carbohydrate source, coming from the honey, amino acids, your nitrogen added from an outside nutrient. And that's the context of what we're talking about today. Vitamins and minerals to a lesser extent from water, also from the nutrient. And then oxygen is something that, while we won't harp on too much today, does play a very, very vital role when it comes to yeast nutrition and health and a complete fermentation. So, Billy, you've obviously been making mead for quite some time, and I have no doubt that you've experienced outcomes of maybe a yeast strain that didn't do well in that stressful environment, or even a yeast strain that had the potential but didn't perform well because of inadequate nutrition. Do you have any examples of any experiences that you've had with either a stalled or sluggish fermentation, something that maybe just would not finish out and you had to figure out, you use every trick in your arsenal to get it to finish? Maybe it was just an appearance or a processing thing like poor flocculation, or, as we keep harping on, undesirable, inconsistent flavor production. Maybe, the fermentation on paper looked great, but it just didn't taste right.
Yeah. I look back at some of the meads we were making at home before we opened, and I was making everyone taste, and still have some around now, and we open them up occasionally. It's like, man, we had some very kind friends. we figured it out when we opened the meadery, or before that. So we've got it down, but there was a lot of trial and error before that. We've seen every kind of issue. I think stalled fermentations are pretty easy to. That's one of the first things that can come up, especially if you're coming from the beer or wine world when it comes to starting out mead making. And then it's easy to kind of figure out, okay, here's what I need to give the yeast to get them through. And then it comes down to, well, how do you get the yeast what they need to finish the job, but finish the job in a healthy way that produces the outcomes that you want, right? You can't make them too happy, and you can't hold back too much. You got to find that perfect medium. That's where nutrient timing and choice and amount and everything, really getting it dialed in for that particular yeast strain, which is what we're going to talk about. That's where it is really, really important. And we've seen it. We've seen every off flavor you can imagine. Makes you a better mead maker for sure.
So, coming to this next slide here, talking about yeast health or nutrition and affecting metabolite production. When we were first talking about this call, we ended up talking about this content and staying on the phone for another 20 minutes talking about H2S and sulfur. And it just goes to show that, even though we have a lot of the information on this, as you're working with different ingredients, you're still coming across these issues, and there's not necessarily a whole lot of accessible data on it. So it's always interesting to see, as you're incorporating these new craft ingredients and using these new processes that mead makers haven't really done before, that these challenges still persist. Devin, did you want to touch on a little bit some of these metabolites specifically, and how they may be seen in utilizing different yeast strains or different nutrient schedules in mead production?
Yes. So like what we said before is different yeast strains are going to produce different metabolite productions. So some yeast strains might produce more hydrogen sulfide, or that could also just be an indicator of a poor, unhealthy yeast fermentation, as well as like hydrogen sulfide sometimes comes off as like a rotten egg sort of smell, while acetaldehyde is more this like green apple paint thinner sort of aroma, considered off flavor. But this is just a likely cause of unfinished fermentation. Different yeast strains produce different levels of this acetaldehyde, as well as how quickly they are able to reabsorb acetaldehyde. Same with diacetyl. Diacetyl is a buttered popcorn flavor that is just a byproduct of amino acid production. So these are all normal variables in yeast fermentation, but these levels really, really depend on what yeast strains you are going to choose. So the overall concept is, depending on what yeast strain you choose, that will greatly affect your final overall flavor production. Something like English strain is going to produce more diacetyl than, like what we said before, a clean strain like California is going to be able to clean up all this acetaldehyde, diacetyl, hydrogen sulfide, as long as they are healthy. But they should clean up pretty clean and fast.
And Billy, what's been your experience with working with different nutrients, different schedules, and different yeast strains when it comes to maybe what's the most common undesirable flavor that you've seen, and what are some ways that you've remedied that, whether it's changing your nutrient schedule or changing your yeast strain or your fermentation temperature?
I think hydrogen sulfide is the most common, and really that's because when you're doing mead making, let's say you're using different fruits are going to have different levels of yeast assimilable nitrogen, right? And if you're not measuring it, you're kind of taking a guess. Same thing with honeys. We found out when we've been doing different honeys here, a lot of the darker honeys will have adjusted our nutrient schedule too. And if we replace that honey with like a really light sage honey or orange blossom, even that little bit less yan is going to impact it, and we'll notice, because we'll get some hydrogen sulfide early on. We're like, oh, okay, we're going to have to adjust for this honey just slightly, and it blows off, and you catch it early. But that, I think that's the most common, because just little changes in the nitrogen level, the yeast will tell you if it needs more, and so I think it's the most common.
Awesome. So, obviously, as Devin was saying, it can be fairly strain dependent on what these nutrient requirements are, but it can also depend on the condition that it's being used in too, right? So gravity, how much oxygen you're dissolving, and probably the most obvious, especially when it comes to homemakers, would be temperature, right? When we're looking at the larger scale, we kind of take that for granted a lot. But when it comes to making these beverages at home, which I know there's a lot of home brewers on the call today, manipulating that temperature can be difficult, especially midsummer, especially depending where you live. And if it's highly unlikely that you have a fermentation chamber, or dedicated fridge. But the composition of nutrients definitely matters a lot too, right? Devin, could you briefly touch on some of the research that you've performed, and maybe just broadly explain what I mean by the composition of nutrients and the different sources of them and what they might see in commercial nutrients?
Yes. So like what Billy mentioned before, a lot of mead makers refer to the nitrogen requirement as YAN, or yeast assimilable nitrogen. This is both a combination of primary amino nitrogen, also known in the brewing industry as free amino nitrogen, and then ammonia and ammonium. So primary amino nitrogen is going to be more of an organic nutrient, nitrogen, versus ammonia, and ammonium is going to be more inorganic, but we will cover that in the next slide, I believe. As well as yeast do need other requirements, as well as vitamins, minerals, and lipids. Some minerals such as zinc really help yeast growth and help develop healthy cell walls needed for budding and reproduction. So by providing these yeast with these nutrients, adequate nutrients, you help provide the longevity of the yeast when they do start to bud and create new yeast cells, and as well as consume all the sugars to produce CO2 and ethanol.
Right. And some good ways of looking at that are obviously looking at your yeast health. I know Billy and I spent some time a while back actually looking at his yeast under the microscope, and looking at the morphology of it, looking at the health, looking if he had a lot of living cells still. But a really good way of looking at it is just performance. And I think, Billy, that's kind of what you were talking about is, you want to know what your yeast looks like and how it's performing, but you also want to know if your pH is dropping, if your gravity is dropping, if it's producing, in what time frame too, if it's producing sulfur that maybe you're not used to. It could be something wrong with yeast health and signs of inadequate nutrition as well. So the way, the nutrients are utilized really comes down to different styles and schedules of additions. Billy, did you want to touch a little bit on some of the different options there? Maybe what you've seen work best, and if it varies at all depending on the style or gravity of mead that you're working with, or the honey source, as you mentioned?
Yeah, in terms of different like staggered nutrient additions. Okay. Most of the mead making world has moved from adding everything. Okay, here's how much nutrients the yeast needs. We're going to add it all in the beginning and then let it do its thing. Most of the mead making world has moved on to staggered nutrient additions. So you're only giving the yeast what they need when they need it, or I guess when is the healthiest time to give it to them, because they'll want it all as soon as they get it, right? So what the most common staggered nutrient addition is for mead making is kind of splitting it up into 4 additions. So you look at how much you need to add. So what's your YAN level you have to hit for that strain, as a low, medium, high, and then figuring out what those additions look like, or the total amount, dividing it into 4. Now, some people will do the first addition at pitch. So right when you pitch the yeast and you're mixing it together, the next one 24 hours later, the next 48 hours later, and then the last addition at the 1/3 sugar break. So that means a third of the way through the fermentation and what you're estimating the fermentation to be. So you have to be checking the gravity or the bricks, or plate, or whatever you're doing, to make sure you know when you hit that point. Because after a certain point, the yeast can't take up those nutrients, and you don't want to add it then after that fact. So a lot of people do that. Now, if you're doing a traditional mead, which is just honey, water, yeast, I highly recommend doing the first addition at pitch. After a lot of discussions with you guys and Scott Labs, people in the wine world, Davis, there's just not enough nutrients in honey to give yeast what they need for those first 24 hours of growth, right? Now that said, if you are doing a mellow, which is fruit, and you're adding a lot of fruit, you'll see a lot of winemakers won't do their first addition until 24 hours after pitch. And that's what Scott Labs recommends. And a lot of that is because there's already so much nutrient from the fruit that they can use that initial amount up, right, and grow and do their thing, and then you start helping them out and help them along the way. So those two options are really, I think, the most common, and then I think we'll get into what kinds of nutrients, right? Yeah.
Yep. So, we obviously spoke about different sources. Like, we're going to really look at nitrogen here when we're talking about nutrition, as being one of the key factors for yeast health and performance. But, there are a lot of options out there. Devin, did you want to kind of just go through a broad sense of what they were? And then I know you've had a hand in developing and testing a lot of the nutrients that are currently on the market. So maybe specifically going through some of the different types of nitrogen sources in these nutrients, and maybe what a mead maker should be looking at when they're trying to source a nutrient for their mead.
Yes. So like what we discussed before, YAN, yeast-assumable nitrogen, is both a combination of organic nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen. For organic nitrogen blends that you might find from manufacturers, that's usually going to be some sort of like yeast hull or yeast extract. So it's going to be 100% organic. All the nitrogen comes from amino acids as well as different peptides. And a good recommendation for 100% organic nutrients is going to be like FAMX Bio, or our product at White Labs, or as well as Fermento. These organic nitrogen, because they are part of amino acids, they do require the yeast to break it down a tiny bit more. So it has been reported that the utilization rate of these organic nitrogens is 3 to 5 times greater than sometimes reported in your FAN values, because the yeast are putting in work. I like to refer to it almost as like yeast on longer chain sugars have to break it down, versus when yeast only get monosaccharides, only single one chains, they get a bit lazy because they don't have to do too much work on this sugar. So same with this nitrogen, organic nitrogen, they have to put in more work, making them work harder, sometimes providing healthier yeast that way. Versus we do have inorganic nitrogen as well. That's usually DAP, or diammonium phosphate. That's diammonium, so ammonium. That, or it's sometimes a blend. So a lot of manufacturers have a blend of DAP with some sort of organic nutrient. So that's what you could see with Seltzer Max or Ferment K. Seltzer Max we did create specifically for hard seltzers, but it is a combination of both DAP and organic nutrients that we found to work very, very well.
Right. So, if I'm looking for a nitrogen source for my mead, looking at it on paper, the organic's much, much more expensive, right? So, Billy, when you're looking at choosing which nitrogen source you're bringing in, is there any benefit to one over another? I know most of these nutrient blends that have DAP in them also have an organic source of nitrogen, but is there any is it advantageous at all to use one or the other when we're just talking about finishing the mead out and trying to get a good flavor profile? What's your take on that?
Yeah, there's there's a lot to consider, and it definitely does impact the fermentation kinetics, and then the sensory results, right? The flavor, aroma, depending on what you use. I will say that there's no right answer, because there are the best mead makers in the world are all using different combinations of these. So you can make an amazing world-class mead in any combination, even all DAP or all fermento. I like to use all organic, because we've kind of tailored our process towards that. When you're giving the yeast organic nitrogen, right, they're going to consume it slower. It's a little more healthy for the kind of fermentation we want to do, which is slow and steady, right? Keep it cool. We want to retain a lot of those volatile aromatics and the subtle, flavors from the honey. And so we're trying to not have a too vigorous of a fermentation. Now, if you are going to be taking on a very, very high gravity mead, or you just want a vigorous fermentation, or you're kind of, there could be a number of reasons. Now, DAP is going to give the yeast really what they want and use up quickly. And so you're going to have slightly different results. A lot of mead makers will do a combination of the two, right? Some organic and then DAP to kind of keep them going. Some will do the opposite. They'll do DAP in the beginning and then organic after a while. The one thing to know about DAP is that if you use it too late and the yeast have already reached a certain ABV, if it's after the 1/3 sugar break, they can't take up the DAP, and you really don't, then you'll have excess DAP at the end of the fermentation, which you can definitely pick out in certain meads. But yeah, I would say there's really kind of looking at what kind of mead you're making, and also what tools you have. If you do not have fermentation control, I would lean more towards organic, because organic is going to keep it a little slower, steadier, not have the huge bursts of yeast activity, which lead to spikes in temperature, right? If you do have a really good temperature control, then that's not as big of a concern. So.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I do want to say with our research studies collaboration with Lost Cause Meadery, we did see that the yeast highly prefer the DAP over the organic. So when you do add both, it will go after the DAP first. Also, most blends, or if you are adding DAP separately, I would try to stay below 40% of that percentage of DAP. Too much DAP can be highly toxic to the yeast cells, like anything in excess. And sometimes a high percentage of DAP does cause this off flavor of 1-propanol, which is a fusel alcohol that almost is that jet fuel sort of aroma and taste, which you want to avoid.
So when you're talking about 40%, you're saying if I'm shooting for 200 ppm of fan levels, you're saying 40% of that being sourced from DAP?
I would try to stay as below as possible. Try not to exceed 40. That might even be at the higher end, but I would always try to not do a bigger ratio of DAP versus organic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So when it comes to dosage, what's your guys' experience? And I'll kind of let you both hit on this. We've got listed here 150 ppm or more of nitrogen, which can be fairly low dependent on your yeast strain and gravity, right? So what are your suggestions? Obviously sending it to a lab and trying to get as much information, and then actually measuring those fan or yan levels is ideal. But without that, what's your take on trying to hit the right nitrogen levels?
That's where some trial and error comes in, and experience with your yeast strain. If it is a wine yeast, then often the manufacturer will have published, is it low, medium, or high nitrogen requiring, and that's helpful. Other strains that are not wine strains, a lot of times that isn't published because, like in the case of beer, it's not really a concern. The wort has all the nutrients that it needs. So what we've found when we have used ale yeast, which I am a huge proponent of, and I think that when used correctly, it's a little different than wine yeast, but when used correctly, it can make just amazing mead. Any traditional we've ever won a major award with was always with ale yeast. And we've found that they're pretty hungry strains. So we shoot for the higher level, closer to like 250 ppm. And we have, at least for the ale strains that we've used, even within, as you guys would know, within ale strains, there's a huge range probably of what they need. But when we've used strains in the English ale kind of range of strains, we've found that they like a lot. And when we don't give them, 250 and above, they let us know. No, there's just really no way around it. So we also, when we're making big melomels, we'll use some strains, like if it's a dark fruit, we'll use D21 wine yeast, and then that's on the low end. So you don't have to add as much, but really what it comes down to, you cannot take like an amount and say, this is gonna work for all strains. It's way more important to get comfortable with the strain and realize what it needs, because there's a lot of other factors as well. If you are fermenting warmer, it's going to increase the activity and maybe need more nutrients, right? If you are doing a higher gravity, you may need to increase your nutrients by 25% based on, or lower by 25% based on the gravity. So you got to think of all the different factors and then get comfortable with the strain you're using. Nice thing is the yeast, they'll tell you early on if they're happy or not, right? At least in terms of not getting enough nutrient, they'll tell you that.
Hey, Billy, I did want to clarify. When you were talking about that 250 parts per million, your usual gravities are usually around that 25 to 30 Plato range. Is that correct?
Yeah. So let's see. We use that for traditional meads. So again, 250 ppm with no contribution from fruit or anything. So all really, and we're assuming none, maybe 10 ppm at the most from the honey. So it's all coming from the nutrients. And 25 to 30 Plato or bricks. And when we do that, we see an extremely clean fermentation, and we'll get English ale, which is supposed to have a 10% ABV limit. We'll get it to finish up at 15% ABV and healthy and clean. So that's a great point, Devin. That's kind of what works for that gravity for us.
Cool. So, we've definitely touched on it a little bit throughout some of the other slides. And I know, Billy, you kind of mentioned, some of those ranges and those yeast strains not being as much of an issue when it comes to beer because of the amount of amino acids and nitrogen present in malt, right? So this conversation doesn't necessarily happen in beer, probably as much as it should, to be honest. It's something that people should be talking about, but there are other nutrient considerations, like you hear zinc spoken about a lot more in beer as opposed to nitrogen. But what's interesting and what we've seen is, in the case of hard seltzer or hard kombucha, wine and cider, a lot of the data and a lot of those concepts apply to a lot of those other beverages that also have monosaccharides or simple sugar bases, right? Because often those fruits or those simple sugars aren't accompanied by the diverse nutrients as something like beer or malt is. When it comes to spirits, it's going to be very variable because that's a very wide category, but really just depending on the wash. We've got a lot of questions that have come through, so I'm glad that we can take a couple minutes to go through that. And I think hopefully we've probably answered a lot of them through this content, but let's definitely spend the next 20 minutes or so diving into that. But to conclude everything that was spoken about, proper yeast nutrition is key for making a quality product. And that's to be said for any fermented product, right? One of the things we spoke about when we were talking about having this conversation today is how is this information applicable to other beverages? Because it really is. And it's important to know how many variables there are out there, even within one beverage category like mead, right? There's a lot of rules of thumb, but it really comes down to understanding your yeast strain and understanding the available nutrients before looking to add additional nutrients, because there can be adverse effects for that too. Not to mention it's just going to make your product more expensive. But each yeast strain and product has a specific set of nutritional needs and creates different flavor profiles. So flavor is something that I like talking about a lot. We can spend days talking about processes, but if the product doesn't taste good at the end of the day, there's definitely something that needs to be reassessed, because it's something that I think is taken for granted a lot, because if it doesn't taste good, we can't sell it, and all the effort that we've put into it is essentially a wash. We also spoke about the source of nitrogen and the timing and the additions impacting fermentation speed and performance. So just understanding that nutrients are not the same across the board, and really understanding what you're putting into your fermentation and how it's going to affect those kinetics, I think is very important. Before we get into the Q&A portion, as I said, we've got a lot building up. We want to say that we do this Wednesday webcast series monthly. We try to do it the third Wednesday of every month, but it's a little variable. Check out whitelabs.com for the schedule of that. Next month, we're going to be doing Homebrew Nerds Unite. It's going to be myself, Jacob Hoover, who's part of our education team, and Chip Walton of Chop and Brew and Northern Brewer. I'm just talking about homebrew content that you can find online, and some of the YouTube series that we've all worked on. So that one's just going to be pretty fun. Hopefully you can join us for that. We also want to say that we have interactive on-demand courses that we're continuously publishing. Our first two are available. The Many Flavors of Fermentation is about a 60-minute course that just describes how yeast influences flavor and aroma compounds. Primarily focused around beer, but it's very applicable when you're looking at some of those major attributes. As you said, H2S, that can be found in many fermented beverages and can be an issue in many fermented beverages. So please join us on that. So to dive into the questions.
And Erik,
Yeah.
I saw a couple that were about the contribution from different nutrients. If I can just throw this out there, it'll probably cover a lot of the questions. So what we have seen is inorganic DAP, diammonium phosphate, about that contributes about 50 parts per million yan at 0.25 grams per liter. What we found with Fermento is about the same in terms of effective ppm yan. The measurable yan is only 10 ppm, but it is used more efficiently. So when you're looking at measuring out ferment or another organic source, I shouldn't say ferment, but organic nutrient versus an inorganic, about the same grams per liter because the organic is used more efficiently. And so it's about 50 parts per million at a quarter gram per liter.
Awesome.
Yes, and that should be the same for our FanMax Bio, our organic nutrient, just like Fermento. Measurable is only 10 parts per million at 0.25 grams per liter, but the applicable nitrogen is going to be at 50 parts per million, so same as Fermento. And then for our Seltzer Max, at probably 150 grams per barrel, you're going to get around 205 parts per million of YAN.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll kind of dish out some of these questions and answer as many as I can, but you know, the always present Kvike strains. So, you know, we're mostly talking about beer here, but I don't know if Billy, if you've heard anybody using the Norwegian farmhouse Kvike strains in Mead, but any wisdom on nutrient needs of Kvike yeast?
We haven't done it. What I've seen is that they are very, you know, you're fermenting hot. They're very vigorous fermenters. So what you have to do is take the nutrients you would normally give them, say ale yeast, so on the high side, but know that they're going to ferment quicker. So you have to move it up, right? And if you don't do that, you're going to get the sulfur smell early on. It's not because they need more nutrients than another ale strain, but they're using them sooner. So you have to kind of adjust your schedule. I've heard people, you know, just maybe half a pitch, half, you know, 24 hours later. You just got to kind of practice with the strain.
Yeah, and what we've kind of seen for beer, and I'll have Devin elaborate a little bit, and that's an interesting approach for me because that's not something that I would have thought about. But for beer, I think where you really need to look at it is lower gravity beers that have a lot less nitrogen present because you're using less malt. Did you want to expand upon that, Devin?
Yes, so based off our beer experiments for nitrogen requirements, we did see Kvike strains are on the higher end versus something like lager that doesn't need a lot of nutrients. And because of that, you do need to add more nutrients than usual. And like what Billy said, because the fermentation is a lot quicker, that 1/3 sugar break is going to happen a lot sooner. So for your staggered nutrient additions, maybe you don't even do it from that 24-48, maybe you even bump it up to less time of maybe a 15-hour or something along those lines, because the Kvike strains are really, really going to take off a lot sooner. So you do want to add those nutrients a lot sooner in the fermentation.
Yeah, and that's probably true for any beverages using a higher temperature for fermentation, right? A lot of times it's not that the Kvike strains are inherently faster, it's just that at higher temperatures they perform and produce a more desirable flavor profile than, say, an English yeast strain. I wouldn't use an English yeast strain at 75, 80 degrees plus, but Kvike strains can produce pretty good quality resulting flavor profiles at those temperatures. So if you're going to be bumping fermentation temperature, look at that third sugar break to come a little bit quicker. So another question, many of the ester other flavor descriptors for yeast strains were developed for beer or wine. How well do these same descriptor or flavor profiles apply to mead? So when we're talking about specific esters, we're talking about the flavor and aroma contributions of that compound on its own. I think where it varies is the style of beverage that it's used in. But if you're talking about, say, isoamyl acetate smelling like banana, that compound itself is responsible for that aroma, not necessarily the beverage that's being used to for that yeast to ferment in. Where it might change a little bit is that banana-like ester might be desirable in one style over another or one beverage over another.
I would add it's a little trickier with wine yeast because a lot of wine yeast do require precursors from the grape to get the type of esters or I guess aroma compounds that you're looking for. Like Sauvignon Blanc is a great example. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think ale, ironically, ale yeast descriptors I've always found much closer, like you mentioned, to what to expect when you use it for mead versus wine yeast. Now, there's if they're talking about esters, and so you have to kind of look at what they mean when they're saying, "Oh, it's fruity, tropical." Well, are they saying that's esters, or that's because of the is it thiols or thiols from
Thiols, yeah. Mm-hmm.
thiols, or is it because of the thiols, which is a precursor in a Sauvignon Blanc grape? Because then you're not going to find that in honey. So you have to, I guess, read the description and try and understand where those aroma and flavors they're talking about are actually coming from. Is that right, Erik?
Yeah, and so kind of what you're saying in the case of Sauvignon Blanc specifically is, what a lot of people call biotransformation. They're specifically talking about the release of some of those aromatics, and the certain yeast strains, especially a lot of wine strains, have the ability to release some of those volatile aromatics that are present in very high quantities in New World Sauvignon Blancs. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a chicken or the egg, because that compound is already there, bound to a sulfur compound, and what that strain's doing is actually releasing it so that you're able to smell it. So you want a yeast strain that's able to release that, and you also want a base must that has a lot of those present. But I think in the case of that question, when we're talking about specific esters, if in that list that we had with acetaldehyde and diacetyl, like those compounds smell the way they are, but the way you perceive it will change depending on the beverage. Because I don't know how common it is, but I think a very low level of diacetyl could probably be pretty pleasant in a mead compared to a German Pilsner. You might disagree with me on that, but
it's going to be harder to pick out, I would think.
yeah. Looking at like a little butterscotch and vanilla and honey, sounds like those flavors meld together a little bit more than a really grassy, noble hop in a Pilsner. So I think, just to show the way that you perceive those compounds vary dependent on the beverage and the style and what else you're using. But the compounds, the descriptions for them are very consistent, but then it's also dependent on the person smelling them, because when Devin mentioned acetaldehyde, everybody says green apple, but you can get pumpkin guts, or I get like a latex paint. So just, knowing how you perceive them, because we can measure it on a gas chromatograph and tell you how much is there, but if you don't perceive it, or you perceive it as a positive or negative, it's really dependent on the producer at that point. We are going to get butt up against time a little bit, and I apologize that we're not going to get to all of these, but you can definitely email me in the group here, and we will respond and continue to have this conversation. So I've heard about zinc use and the limitations or lack in the presence of wort must, knowing that this is one mineral that's often helps cell cycle and reproduction of yeast. Do you have any experience using zinc supplement, such as zinc gluconate, and I've heard it generally helps effective speeding up fermentation and preventing stuck fermentations?
Yeah, we do have zinc supplements such as servomyces, or I believe even dry yeast, how they rehydrate. You could use servomyces to help rehydrate that yeast. But also FanMax Bio provides enough zinc for a healthy fermentation. Like what we said before with inorganic nitrogen, too much zinc could also be toxic, so it's providing that right levels. But a lot of nutrient blends that you are buying already do possess enough zinc for that fermentation.
Yeah, and again, coming back to beverage specific, a lot of the way nutrients are added in beer, you're going to be adding it to the kettle, and if you have high amounts of trub, what we've seen is that zinc actually binds to the trube and doesn't actually make it to your fermenter. So depending how you're adding it, fortunately with mead, you're keeping that all contained that you're putting in there. So it's a little bit more straightforward. Someone wanted to intentionally produce a buttered popcorn flavor. How would one do that, encouraging diacetyl production? Just probably what Devin previously said. Choosing a yeast strain that's known to produce high amounts of diacetyl is going to be the best route for doing that. I'm going to let Billy take this one since we were talking about it before, but can H2S production be caused by temperature problems such as too high, or is it only caused by lack of nutrients?
Well, they kind of exist together, right? So all things being equal, you give it enough nutrients, high temps are going to increase yeast activity, which is going to affect a lot of different flavor and aroma outcomes. I think normally you're going to get more of the fusels and kind of rocket fuel, right? But high temperature does mean more activity, which means the yeast will need more nutrients. So it can lead to sulfur aroma, but you can also feed it enough and you'll still run into other problems. So I guess that's my take on that.
It depends is an answer that we like to say. It's as soon as you say it's one way or another, somebody gets irritated that it doesn't work out for them. And it really, there's so many variables when it comes to all this information. This regarding temperature, is it best to pick a yeast that will be in your known range with no temp control rather than a strain that might have better characteristics at temperatures you can't reach? I personally would always say it's best to use a strain that's known to tolerate the ranges you're fermenting in, as opposed to trying to use a strain that might be ideal for that but not really work well in the temperature range you're given. Again, especially, all we've probably been thinking about, the three of us in San Diego, is this heat wave that's been going on for 2 weeks now, and it's limiting a lot of people in their home brewing, especially further east. But Billy, you guys are nice near the coast now, so.
Yeah, and we spent a lot of money on glycol.
Temperature control, sure.
It definitely makes working in the meadery a little nicer versus Miramar on weeks like this.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, so we get to visit you less, but it's more incentive to cruise over and say hi to you guys. Is liquid yeast, I'm going to say, worth rehydrating a dry yeast with Go Firm? Sorry, I having a tough time to decipher the question, but will you guys touch on prepping a culture for use? So if it's a dry strain, utilizing a nutrient when you're rehydrating it compared to what the process is with a liquid strain, and then we'll get 2 more questions and have to sign off.
I can talk about dry. Yes, you need to rehydrate dry yeast if you are making a mead, because it is a stressful environment for the yeast. So even if you don't do it for beer or whatever, you should always do it for mead. Easiest answer is for rehydrating dry yeast. Scott Labs has a very good overview of how to do that. What nutrient to use, which is Go Firm, Protect Evolution, what temperatures to do it at, how to do it. I found that everyone that uses that process exactly has success. And if you stray from that, do it at your own peril. For liquid yeast, we always made a starter at home. We don't now, but we just pitch more. But I don't know if Devin, you want to cover liquid yeast?
Yeah, so liquid yeast, you wouldn't need that rehydration phase. I would suggest a starter just to get them acclimated to that honey medium versus a malt medium. But overall, based off our collaboration with Lost Cause, we did like the liquid yeast more because it did ferment a tiny bit quicker than our dry yeast strain.
And we did notice flavor differences too, right, between the two?
Yes, that was our biggest choice for liquid strains. Was we did really like the flavor profile of our liquid strain versus using a dry strain.
For the comparable strain in different forms, right? So you're not taking two completely different strains and comparing them, but as comparable as possible using the liquid version versus the dry version. Can you please clarify the schedule of nutrient additions? So essentially, how many total nutrient additions are you looking at when you are doing staggered nutrient additions?
4 additions, and like I said, if you're doing a traditional mead, I would recommend starting the first at pitch, and then 24 hours, 48 hours, 1/3 sugar break. If you are making a mellow or there are people that have a lot of success, because if you're rehydrating, if you're using dry yeast, you are adding some nutrient in the rehydration process. There are people that no matter what kind of mead they're making will wait and not do the first addition until 24 hours later. So 24, 48 hour, 72, and then 1/3 sugar break. What I will say is if you are gonna add nutrients at pitch, I would add much more organic than inorganic at pitch, and definitely don't add any inorganic if you are rehydrating, because it is toxic to the yeast at that point.
That's a great takeaway, and kind of touches on this last question. So does a session mead, something that's going to come out to 5 to 7%, still need nutrients, or would you be okay with just adding nutrients during rehydration?
Does a session mead need nutrients?
So is there sufficient nutrients in the rehydration, or should you still be looking at adding nutrients during fermentation?
Yeah, there's not a lot of YAN contribution from the rehydration nutrients. It does add some, but not enough to even, I wouldn't count on that to get through even a session mead. I would still add nutrients. Now, when you're doing a session mead, you're not only going to not need as much, but a lot of people will just add it up front because it's just going to go too quickly to the 1/3 sugar break and just travel too fast to keep up with it. So it doesn't make much sense to try and split it up. A lot of people will do, just split it into 2, at pitch and the next day or whatever. Depends on what you mean by session, what the starting gravity is and all that. But I would still definitely add nutrients, especially if it's a traditional mead, session mead.
Cool.
Yeah, for rehydration, like Go Firm or even Saccharomyces, that does not really add much YAN values at all. So I would go ahead and still add organic nutrients, which would be more around the range of what was posted before, of around that 150 parts per million is a good range for a quick session mead. And because again, must has little to no nutrients, maybe like 10 parts per million of YAN, so not enough to complete fermentation.
Great. So again, I apologize. We have a lot of questions that we're unable to get to, but if anybody does have additional questions, I want to follow up, you can shoot me an email at efowler, Fowler, at whitelabs.com, and I can bring the panelists here into the fold, and we can continue the conversation over the next couple days. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. Somebody asked if we could post it to the Reddit group. I don't know if either of you guys are on there, but somebody can feel free to snag the link from our YouTube once it's up for sure. And we want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank Devin and Billy for taking time out of their day. It's something we've been geeking out about for quite some time, and I know you guys have been working on an R&D project for quite a while that you hope to further expand on how we came up with some of the topics that we even discussed today. So be on the lookout for that. Cool. Thank you all. Cheers.
Thank you.